So today I'm going to be talking about a few players in the 2022 NHL draft that I think are pretty consistently overrated. So if that sounds good to you guys, do be sure to stick around to the end of the video to hear my opinions on these guys. And with that being said, let's just jump right into it with the first player who is perhaps the most controversial on this list, and I almost left him off entirely because of that, but that is Denton Mateychuk. Now, Mateychuk is a guy that has a lot of skill and a lot of upside. So, for those reasons alone, I think you could make a reasonable argument to justify the places where he is ranked. And I think that is fair. However, the style of game Mateychuk plays just worries me quite a lot. And I will say this, generally speaking, I do value skill and upside over a lot of other things. So it's not that I hate Mateychuk, it's just that his style of game is really weird and I don't think it projects well to the NHL. So despite all that skill he has, he's going to have to transform his game a little bit, or maybe even a lot of bit, in order to make it work at the NHL level, and that worries me. So to have him ranked inside the top 10, which a lot of people do, just worries me enough that I would not have him quite that high. The second player I want to talk about is Marco Kasper. So Kasper is a player that is okay. I would describe him, if I had to describe him very briefly, I would just say he is a effective hockey player. He doesn't have any real high end skills, in my opinion. He doesn't have a high end shot. He's not an elite playmaker. He's not an elite skater. He's not elite defensively, but he does everything good enough. And quite contrary to Mateychuk, I would say he plays a very projectable game. But for me, it's the exact opposite with him. It's just that the upside isn't there. I think Kasper could be a perfectly fine third line center, but I don't think you're ever really going to be getting much more than that. And this is another guy who is ranked in the top 10 for a lot of people, or at least in the first half of the first round. And for me, if you're going to be selecting a player that high, I would much rather take a swing on a guy that has a much higher ceiling than a guy like Marco Kasper. So wherever Kasper goes, I don't think he's going to be a bad pick because I do think he will play a solid role in the NHL. And anytime you draft a player who plays a solid role in the NHL, like that is not a bad draft pick. But compared to some guys that could go after him who have a lot higher upside, it could end up looking kind of questionable. The third player I want to talk about is a somewhat similar player in terms of their style, and that is Conor Geeky. Now, Geeky, personally, I think is a bit more overrated than a guy like Kasper because for me, Kasper is a very safe pick, while Geeky is safe ish. He's another guy who I don't think has a ton of upside, but they kind of play or will play a similar role in the NHL, in my opinion, or I guess I'm predicting that. I think Geeky is another guy who could be a solid third line center, but he has a little more work that he needs to do to develop into that role than Kasper does. The main concern with Geeky for me is his skating. His skating is just not good, in my opinion. However, I will say that Geeky does have a bit more upside in terms of offense than a guy like Kasper because of his playmaking. Geeky is a really solid playmaker, and that is his best skill or trait by far. But I don't really see that translating into him being a top six center, maybe a second line center. So, like, he does have a bit more upside. Maybe he can be a solid or like decent second line center who doesn't really score a lot of goals, but is capable of getting a lot of assists, especially if he's on a line with some goal scorers. But he does have quite a bit of work, or a decent amount of work, that he needs to do to get him there. So I don't think he's quite as safe as people think he is, and I also don't think his upside is nearly as high as a lot of people think. So again, if you're drafted, and Geeky seems to be ranked a bit higher than Kasper, or I feel like they've switched, they've gone back and forth actually. But either way, Geeky is another guy who seems to be going in the top half of the first round, and I would much rather take somebody with more upside in that position. The fourth player I want to talk about is Nathan Gaucher. Now, I don't think Gaucher is nearly as overrated as players like Geeky or Kasper, but again, he's another guy that doesn't have a ton of upside, in my opinion. I do think he is a pretty safe pick, and he can play in pretty much any role you put him in. He is pretty reasonable, responsible defensively, and I really see him as being a solid bottom six forward, maybe another third line center guy, maybe like a third line winger. He strikes me as a bit of like an Andrew Cogliano type player. Uh, could develop into like a defensive specialist who does have a bit of offense. I mean, obviously Cogliano at this point in his career doesn't have a ton of offense, but there were some years where Cogliano put up a decent amount of points and scored a decent amount of goals. And I think Gaucher can be that guy. He does seem to be ranked a bit higher than I would take him, though, again, because I don't think he has a ton of upside. Uh, yeah, I think his upside is fairly comparable to Geeky, although I don't know, maybe a little bit more of a goal scorer. It's tough to say. We're kind of splitting hairs with these three guys, Geeky, Kasper, and Goucher. But Goucher, I do think, is ranked a little bit more reasonably, but still higher than I would take him. Finally, the last player I want to talk about is a very large human being in Maverick Lamoureux. Now, Lamoureux is big, and that's about the best quality he has. Now, I don't mean to be too harsh on Lamoureux, but in my opinion, he's just not super consistent defensively, and he doesn't really have any projectable offense at all, in my opinion. Now, I do think he will play in the NHL, and this is a guy who is projected to go like in the mid late second round, so that's not terrible. Again, anytime you're getting an NHL player, even that late in the draft is pretty solid, but I don't know how good of an NHL player he's going to be. His skating is decent, especially for a guy of his size, but it isn't fantastic. And I'm just a bit worried that he is going to, or I should say that faster, better skaters than him are going to make him look silly on a fairly regular basis in the NHL. And for that reason, I don't really see him being much more than a bottom pairing defenseman who is just kind of meh, like basically maybe slightly above replacement value, who plays a lot of games largely because of his size and physicality. That is the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you believed it deserved a like, go ahead and give it a like. Um, and yeah, I'll put another video on screen for you guys now if you want to stick around for a bit. If you don't, that's okay too. But whatever you do, have a nice day.